That's because your husband owns you, doesn't he, Mary? Am I right, Peter?
Get some help.
What's that smell? It's the smell of desire. Rotting turtle. This is Rotting Turtle after what has been months of trying to get this made and together and perfected. We have achieved perfection. Rotting Turtle, a fragrance for all. It's a unisex perfume. It smells fantastic. The original thing that happens here is Danny made a joke in a script saying it would be impossible to sell, for example, a perfume called Rotting Turtle. And I was like, au contraire, Danny. And somehow, I released this. I didn't even announce it was up. I mentioned it on the website. Yeah, I mentioned this previously. We started a website, got everything together like a couple of weeks ago, and didn't expect anyone to actually go there and buy stuff. Someone discovered the website, put it on the subreddit. There's a subreddit. I don't know what the link is. I'm sorry. I'm focusing on selling the Rotting Turtle. And so I was like, au contraire, Danny. And I made a perfume called Rotting Turtle with the help of Will, who does Beard Blaze with me. And we made this, and it smells fantastic. And I smell it really strongly now because I just put it on. This is available at rottingturtle.net if you'd like to get some. And you absolutely should. It's fantastic. I think it's so cool that I actually made a perfume. And we've got more perfumes coming. One's called Rotten Badger. One's called Corpse Flower. Yes, that's right. Ridiculous perfumes from your boy. Rottingturtle.net!
Whoa, what's up?
No promo codes, no special deals, because it's mine. The past was the worst. Horrific things we used to think were totally fine. I like the fact that the past was the worst has become a series, like we just look back as like, oh fuck, alright. And don't get me wrong, the future is no picnic. But, I mean, the past was the worst. Mr. Jackson. Oh, what happens here? Danny writes me a script. I shall read the script. Sam shall sprinkle in some of the finest vintage memes, and let's go. Mr. Jackson was new to the neighborhood and had popped next door to introduce himself to Mr. Birdwhistle, who had proved to be most hospitable and had ordered the maid to bring out the posh tea and biscuits. Oh, la-di-da. This was the mid-19th century, so there was no sign of a jammy Dodger or a Jaffa cake, but the home-baked granola digestives proved to be most adequate. It's like, yeah. You know, people always like, oh, home-cooked stuff is better. I'm like, yeah, but your home-cooked biscuits are weird and Jaffa cakes are amazing. So, not always, okay? Just not always. Mr. Jackson was then treated to a guided tour of Mr. Birdwhistle's luxurious home, and his eyes soon fell onto a large family photograph taking pride of place in the drawing room. Also, what happened to drawing rooms? There's no more drawing rooms. You think, you know, you're buying a house or whatever, and you're like, ooh, this room would be an excellent... I don't even know what drawing rooms were for. Do people actually draw in them? I don't think so. I think it probably had some old meaning, like drawing a bath, but it definitely wasn't a bath. I don't know. Look, drawing rooms. Should we start a movement to bring them back? I'm going to rename my living room the drawing room. I don't know if that's appropriate or not. I don't know what a drawing room is.
Stop it. Get some help.
Such a sight was a relative rarity back then. Mr. Jackson had never experienced the privilege and wonder of having his own photograph taken. The rise of the first publicly available photographic press, the, good lord, daguerreotype, in the 1840s had made home photography possible for the first time, but it wasn't until later in the centuries that it would develop into a reasonably affordable pastime. It is crazy that we've had photography for nearly 200 years. I mean, that's crazy. Is it crazy? I feel like that's crazy, because when you think of like the early 1800s, you're like, yeah, it was people painting. That's how it looked. It was just paintings. Nope. Most Victorians would consider themselves lucky if they'd be able to strike a pose just once during their lifetime. Holy shit, how times have changed. Mr. Birdwhistle clearly wasn't short of a bob or two. He observed Mr. Jackson's interest in photography and went on to explain how it showed 3 generations of Birdwhistles, including himself, his son and his father. Mr. Birdwhistle isn't a real person, Danny. Why is he called Mr. Birdwhistle? Are you making some sort of joke at my expense? I don't want to read too much into it, but my name is Whistler. Is Birdwhistle? I don't know. Let's just move on. Mr. Jackson felt as if there was something slightly odd about the photograph, but it took him a moment to put his finger on it. Then it stared him vacantly in the face. Mr. Birdwhistle's father may have cut a dashing figure dressed up in his smartest gear, but there was no escaping the fact that he was clearly as dead as a doornail. Oh, I know about this. Yeah. In the past, like, people would have their photograph taken after they were dead, so they'd prop them up next to their family and take a photo with it. It's like, that's weird. Nowadays, we generally prefer to relive golden memories of missed loved ones by looking back through family albums depicting moments when they were still very much alive and kicking. But back in the 19th century, it was very common to hang photographs on the wall depicting the cold faces and slack eyes of family members after they'd already kicked the bucket. That is so weird. What's that picture of? Yeah, it's my dead dad. Okay. Why? We've got generations of dead people on our walls. Ah! But people were also into like all sorts of weird like death masks, where it's like they put like a plaster mold over your face when you're dead. It's like, what are we up to? Stop it. In fact, it was the most common form of photography of the time, and in many cases, this would be the only photograph ever taken of the subject, so you'd hope that the photographer caught their good side. The concept of memento mori had been around since ancient times, an artistic or symbolic reminder of the fact that we're all ultimately doomed. As the Latin term translates, remember that you have to die. Oh, please. Cryogenics, Danny. Cryogenics, memento mori. You, I'm never gonna die. I'm gonna live forever. Hopefully. I mean, probably not, but hopefully.
Daddy, chill.
And often involved the recently deceased having their, whoops, I missed a page, picture painted, or getting locks of hair cut for family members to wear in lockets, or having a death mask made of their face from wax or plaster to wear at the next fancy dress party. It's like, oh, who are you going as? Yeah, my dead granddad. Okay. Happy Halloween! The rise of photography in the 19th century meant that it only became more cost-effective and desirable to have a newfangled photograph taken of your dead family members instead of commissioning an artist to paint an original piece. It's like, yeah. The artists are just waiting for like famous people to die so they can go paint their pictures when they're dead. What is up with this? At least, I mean, you're an artist. Just paint them so they look alive. Why not? And thus, post-mortem photography became the new withered face of memento mori. There are different ways of approaching the concept. Some like to go for a solo portrait, either laid out on the deathbed or propped up in a chair. If a young child had died, he or she would often be placed on their mother's lap. Other photographs involve the whole surviving family posing with the deceased. But they were all usually quite somber and tasteful affairs. You wouldn't find the rest of the family giving a cheeky wink or a jolly thumbs up to the dead geezer in the chair. I mean, yeah, it would be a bit weird if they were like, what's up? Yeah, peace, bro.
What's up?
Some of the photographs probably worked out better than others. I'll leave it to Sam to decide if it's appropriate to show the greatest hits and misses from a gallery of corpses. I don't know what YouTube's policy on that is, but it's probably not super friendly towards it. While some of the photographs seem to be quite natural and peaceful, other more unfortunate examples aren't quite so serene, with their plague-infested faces and bulging eyeballs reflecting the terrible final moments. Oh god, I've seen pictures of these, but I've never seen one where it's like that guy clearly had the plague and now his family have the plague because they're all in this little room together getting their photograph. They probably had to sit there for like an hour just breathing in plague. Oh, what are we doing? You really wouldn't want to see some of these hanging over your fireplace. But there's a common misconception that the Victorians made every effort to fabricate the illusion that the deceased was still alive. Admittedly, it can sometimes be difficult to spot which family member of a group is the dead one, which probably led to some particularly fun parlor games back in the day. It's like, all right. Which is the one who's dead? It's like, well, Granddad's not here. So it's him, isn't it? It's him. It's him. You'd have to play it with other people's families. You'd go around, borrow their photographs. What the fuck? Some suggest that you can spot a big clue if you see an individual using a posing stand, indicating that the corpse is being artificially propped up. But it's actually the other way around. A posing stand is usually a guarantee that the individual was alive at the time. The early cameras required long exposure periods, and so any last-second fidgeting from the inexperienced and nervous subjects resulted in blurry living figures standing alongside the perfectly clear and crisp and notably non-fidgety dead figure. So it's either you've got excellent control of your body, or you're dead. It's like, wow, that guy is crisp. And now he's going to be a crisp when we incinerate his body because he had plague. The past was the worst. Also, the worst thing about this in the photographs is just like casually people dying of plague. I feel like the plague killed like a third of Europe's population at one time. It's nuts. So the posing stand was used to try and keep the living subjects from moving around too much. The Victorians wouldn't have been interested in such deception anyway, thanks to plagues and epidemics and even just common illnesses which couldn't yet be medically treated. Yeah, like simple infection. They were practically rolling around in ubiquitous ashes of death, and the whole point of post-mortem photography was to embrace a prolonged period of mourning rather than to create a pre-Photoshop fake which suggested the subject was still breathing. By the late 1930s, post-mortem photography had largely fallen from favor thanks to a shift in attitudes over extended public mourning, the medicalization of death, and an improvement in infant mortality rates. From it's gotta be from shockingly high to slightly less shockingly high. And the fact that everyone could afford to start taking lots of nicer photographs of living family members enjoying an ice cream or a donkey ride on the beach, rather than just waiting patiently until they died before they got out the camera. And considering that most of us would probably now recoil at the thought of staring at a deathly, ghoulish image of our grandparents while trying to enjoy our breakfast, post-mortem photography is unlikely to start trending anytime soon. I don't know, Danny, have you ever met Instagram? It's like the trends, or Facebook before, weird trends. And I definitely wouldn't put this past society. I definitely wouldn't. I don't think that's I don't think it's impossible. But maybe not as unlikely as some of these other habits and traditions and practices from the black and white days, which would have trouble gaining universal approval in today's over-fussy times. Was that the intro? I believe that was the introduction. Welcome to another episode of Business Plays. Carnival of cruelty. While some animal blood sports are still legal in certain parts of the world, oh my god, I've got a Spanish friend and he was telling me about the bullfighting. And so I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's pretty intense, right? The guy goes in there and he fights a bull to the death and then he stabs him. And my friend was like, my dude, it is so much worse than that. Before they rile up the bull, there's a dude called a picador. And he stabs little knives into the bull in non-dangerous place. He's like, hey, gives him a little stab with a... Oh, there is a man collecting trash outside my window. Hello. Will he notice me? I hope not. That would be awkward. Oh, hello. He noticed me. Dobry den. Yeah, and there's this picador dude. He's like, and he stabs these extra knives into the bull. I'm like, that is intense. Just to rile the bull up a bit more. And I'm like, I feel there were other dudes as well who did something. I have a feeling one of them was called a luchador, but I think that's a Mexican wrestler. It's like picador, luchador, same, but different. Sam speaks Spanish. Sam, do you know what I'm talking about? I don't know. Is that...
Cocaína. No. Flower.
All take place behind closed doors away from the prying eyes of the law and decent folk. There was, however, a time when bloodlust and animal cruelty was globally considered to be perfectly acceptable entertainment for a typical Friday night down your local watering hole. It's like, yeah, Tom, should we go for a beer and watch these animals fight to the death? It's like, yeah, all right, mate. Let's do it. And many UK pubs still proudly bear their original name describing what sort of activity was enjoyed by the regular crowd hundreds of years ago. Ye Old Fighting Cocks in St Albans, Hertfordshire, lays claim to being the oldest pub in England, and the name doesn't describe the clientele. It's a reference to how the pub staged cockfighting competitions in the barn, with the unwilling participants often having razor blades attached to their feet. Yeah, cockfighting's intense as well. That shit's intense. Meanwhile, the Dog and Duck in Soho, London may conjure up images of the two animals enjoying a splash in a puddle, but it's actually describing the duck baiting competition staged around the back, in which the ducks were thrown into a pond with their wings constrained so they couldn't fly away, before a pack of dogs was released to rip them to bits. Holy shit. That doesn't really sound fair. Is that at least with the cockerels? They're fighting against each other. I mean, bullfighting is obviously the man is going to win because he's a man. He might not have the big strength of the bull, but he has a massive brain, like relatively. What are you doing outside my window, man? I think you got it. I think you got all the dirt. I really do. It's not a big window.
I'm the trash man. I come out, I throw trash all over the ring.
Also, I really enjoy a beer called Duck and Dog. And it just made me think that it's not about the duck and dog just, hanging out as friends. It's because the dogs destroyed the ducks. That's so sad. Dogs.
Fuck!
Good boy.
Blood sports of all kinds were... really, it's the people. The dogs the dogs would naturally be... Everyone. Blood sports of all kinds were popular around the world between the 16th and 18th centuries, as the punters kept finding new ways of inflicting cruelty upon pretty much every creature they could get their hands on. It was seen as cheap and cheerful pastime for people without much money who couldn't afford to go into theatre, and their only limit was their sadistic imaginations. While most of us would be grimly familiar with the concept of dogfighting and bear baiting, there were some pretty weird ones too. Cock throwing.
Zoinks! It's the gay blade
has a misleading title. It does not involve anyone throwing a cock. Instead, the rooster is tied to a post while the players throw weighted sticks known as cock steals at the poor bird until it dies. How is that fun? This is just lame. This was particularly popular in England when it was going through a strong anti-French period in the 18th century, as the cock is the symbol of France. Is it also just funny that a cock is the symbol of France? Isn't that enough? Rat baiting was a sport in which dogs could try and kill as many rats as possible in a small enclosed space. The world record holder was a bull terrier called Billy, who once managed to catch 100 rats within just 5.5 minutes. Holy shit, Billy. You monster. The blood sport was allowed to carry on for longer than most and was still being played in the early 20th century, largely because rats are vermin and don't attract much sympathy from the public. In fact, it was only ultimately banned over concerns for the welfare of the dogs. Oh, we humans love our dogs. And we hate rats because they're dirty and give us the plague. Fox tossing. Wow, there's a lot of semi-sexual words in there, isn't it? Like cock, tossing. Fox tossing was unusual in that it was enjoyed by members of the fox-hating aristocracy rather than the mob down the pub. Teams of two would enter an arena set up in a field or courtyard, with each team holding between them a sling or a sheet. As the foxes were let loose onto the arena, each team would try and ensnare the creature in their sling and toss it into the air, with the highest throw declared the ultimate winner. Some participants managed to throw the foxes as high as 7.5 meters, and as you can imagine, it usually didn't end brilliantly for the fox. If you've run out of live foxes, you could always use hares or badgers, but the author of a 1919 book on the sport strongly advises against trying to use wildcats. Holy shit, dude. He writes, "Wildcats do not give a pleasing kind of sport if they cannot bury their claws and teeth in the faces or legs of the tossers." I wonder if this is the word where the word tosser came from. They cling to the tossing slings for dear life, and it is next to impossible to give one of these animals a skillful toss. Does toss have the same meaning in American English as it does in British English? Because in English, it means masturbation.
FBI, open up!
Goose pulling was another popular sport with the wealthier people of England, America, and Belgium. It's a strange collection of countries. A live goose with a well-oiled head, is hung from its legs by a rope or a pole about 10 feet in the air. Competitors on horseback would try to ride beneath the rope at full pelt and try to be the first to rip off the slippery head with their bare hands.
He's kinda gay.
This is some up shit. It's still played today in parts of Belgium and Germany, but either using an already dead goose or a dummy goose. Guys, what is up? Germany were like later on the game. It was like Belgium, UK, and France were like really into this back in the 19th century. And then Germany were like, yeah, we could be into that. What's the year? 1994. Most recently, the west coast of the United States used to enjoy a bit of octopus wrestling in the 1960s. I've heard of this. Again, the name for this one is misleading, as the octopus is quite a nervous creature and doesn't usually feel the mood for participating in a wrestling bout. Instead, they usually just try to flee in panic as teams of divers grapple with the creatures and try to bring them to the surface in a bid to win a trophy for wrestling the biggest octopus. The World Octopus Wrestling Championships, held in Puget Sound, Washington, was such a big deal that they were often televised. Guys, if you're televising blood sports, you need to check yourself before you wreck yourself. And Spain, if bullfighting is televised, it's like, just think about what's up. We've developed the television and the ability to live broadcast this a long time ago, and yet we're still, and we're using it to watch live animal cruelty. I'm just saying that's some right? And that this is me, famously not the biggest animal lover. And I'm just like, why is it so up? Most blood sports fell out of fashion during the 18th century. It's 200 years ago, Spain. Come on, 300 years ago. In an attitude towards animal cruelty, and animal baiting was eventually banned outright in England in 1835. But considering that fox hunting, well, that's now banned, bullfighting, cow tipping, and goat marrying are still considered to be acceptable in some parts of the world today. Oh, fox hunting's banned in the UK, I don't know. Is fox hunting a thing in other countries? I thought it was just a thing that like posh British twats did. Maybe we shouldn't be looking back with too much scorn at those primitive barbarians from history. Yeah, we should be. And anyone who's doing this today, as I said, they should check themselves before they wreck themselves. Because there's no way you're going to be in like 100 years being like, yeah, that was cool. All the other countries stopped doing it, we didn't. Oh my god. Human zoos. A typical fun... Oh, good lord, I know this one. I just read over that title, not thinking about it much, but this is the one where they took like people from like random like indigenous cultures and put them in a zoo. Because of course we because the past was the worst. A typical fun Saturday afternoon with the kids in the late 19th century may have involved a visit to the ice cream parlor, followed by a trip to the local human zoo, where the whole family could enjoy staring at live primitive African exhibits that they'd only ever read about in books. They were more commonly known as ethnological expositions at the time, and often claimed to be legitimate educational resources for Westerners. Black and indigenous people were shipped over from their native countries and displayed in makeshift natural habitats. So what the wrong with us? So that paying customers could peek over the barrier and observe these unusual foreigners at work and play in something resembling their natural habitat. It's not entirely clear how much say the living exhibits had over their dramatic career move. It's possible that most of them agreed to be put on show, otherwise they could easily have scuppered the whole enterprise by just sitting on the floor and flipping the finger at everyone who came to visit. Or then again, some of them may have felt pressured into playing ball, otherwise they might risk getting skipped over during feeding time at the zoo. Yeah, I mean, obviously. It's like, we're voluntarily behaving like this. It's like, no, we didn't pretend to be like native, doing our native shit. Because the last time we did it, they whipped the shit out of us. But it certainly proved to be a lucrative option for the guys in suits on the right side of the fence. Between around 1870 and 1950, it's at 1950. It's estimated the total of 1.4 billion people visited at least one human zoo across locations such as New York, London, Paris, Milan, and Hamburg. Depending on which branch you were visiting, you could potentially watch entire artificial villages of Kanaks or Senegalese performing war dances or religious rituals for the punters, or you might gawp and jeer at an Arabian camel herder, Zulu warriors, or Hindu rope dancers. One of the biggest human zoos was held at the 1904 St. Louis World Fair, which featured a 47-acre paddock packed with more than 1,000 Filipinos taken from dozens of different tribes. This is so up. The centerpiece of the show was the impoverished Igorot village, in which tribespeople were dressed in minimal clothing and were given dead dogs to eat every day by the zookeepers for the entertainment of the crowds. Oh my god, it's just so bad. I don't even want to make jokes. This is just so unbelievable. That 1950? So my grandparents were like fully adult at that point. Like, what's going on? Grandma, why? While it's true that Igorots did very occasionally eat dog during ceremonial rituals, they were probably a bit disappointed to find it on the menu every single day. One exhibit from this, especially like dead dogs, they're probably not like breeding them live dogs for eating, they're probably just like, yeah. Tom's puppy died, so we're feeding it to the people at the zoo. Dude. Fuck! One exhibit from the St. Louis World Fair was a Congolese guy by the name of Otu Benga. After the fair closed business, Otu moved to the Bronx Zoo under the misapprehension that he'd been hired to look after the elephants. Once he arrived there, his teeth were filed to points and he was shoved into a dirty monkey house where he was displayed as a savage pygmy. Otto was eventually released and intended to make a return trip to Africa, but the outbreak of the First World War put a stop to all passenger ship travel. Slipping into a depression, he shot himself in the heart with a borrowed pistol at the age of just 32. Not surprising in any way whatsoever, because people treated him like an absolute piece of shit. Fucking hell. Part of the whole reasoning behind this shameful entertainment was to emphasize the alleged inferiority of these savage foreigners. Oh, it just gets worse, doesn't it? And to even justify their slavery and subjugation and genocide at the hands of clever Westerners. And it's no surprise that hundreds of the exhibits are estimated to have died from less than 5-star conditions in which they were effectively caged. It's an alarming thought that these largely forgotten human zoos have probably played a huge role in the development of modern racism. Shocking. But it's often wrongly claimed that the first person to ban human zoos was that well-known champion of human rights, Adolf Hitler. While it's true that zoos did begin to disappear during his time in power, that was largely just coincidental timing of the general public gradually coming to the realization that putting mostly African people on exhibits in zoos might not be entirely ethical. It's weird what happened in Germany a few years later then, isn't it? Now. Sometimes it's hard to be a woman. We obviously still have a long way to go before we can say that we've fully cracked the concept of true gender equality. No kidding. Women still get paid less than men, are less likely to receive a promotion, are underrepresented in many different sectors, and it's still very rarely to see women join the queue down at the local sperm donor clinic. Equal rights for all. Why should they not be allowed to do that? I see no reason not to.
Just like a woman.
But trying to be positive for a moment, at least we've made some significant progress over the last few hundred years. Yeah, for sure. Like I said at the beginning of the one, like the present is no picnic. Women still can't donate sperm. And I mean, more really do a lot of other shit. But it was worse. It was almost 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 200 years ago. it just gets progressively better all the time, which is really nice. I was surprised to discover that up until fairly recently, choosing to keep your maiden name after marriage in the United States wasn't just considered bad form, it could also lead to serious consequences. Your employer could legally refuse to issue your payroll, and you could even be banned from voting. Hawaii was the last state to put an end to this nonsense, but they left it until 1976 before Mary Miller could finally breathe a sigh of relief as she walked down the aisle with Gregory Shufflebottom. I bet Shufflebottom's a real name. That sounds like a real name. Shufflebottom even sounds British. There was a kid at school called Winterbottom. Unfortunate. One of the things to bear in mind for a woman getting married is that absolutely everything you owned, including your house, became the legal property of your new husband, regardless of how anything originally came into your possession. That's because your husband owns you, doesn't he, Mary? Am I right, Peter?
Get some help.
Unlike single women, married women simply weren't allowed to control property. So if Mary Miller had been bequeathed a luxurious family mansion, Danny, because she couldn't possibly earn it on her own, could she, Danny? It would automatically become the Shufflebottom mansion after the vows had been shared. The Married Women's Property Act was first passed in 1848, and this declared that married women should have the same control and rights over property as single women. But it wasn't until the 1920s that society finally began to accept this concept. It only took them 72 years to start obeying the law.
Mr. I am the law.
Over 100 years ago, women had very little protection or rights in the workplace, and unlike men, their hours weren't even regulated, so they could in theory be ordered to work 24-hour shifts or risk losing their job. A landmark legal case in Oregon in 1908 finally ruled that women shouldn't be forced to work shifts exceeding 10 hours, but the reasoning was a little more than dubious. It wasn't really anything to do with legal rights or equality. The court simply felt that if Mary Miller worked excessive hours, it could lead to a reduction in the quality of the maternal duties that Gregory Shufflebottom would naturally expect her to provide after he'd taken everything that she owned. Oh my god, the past. You perhaps couldn't blame Mary Miller for wanting out of this but the concept of divorce was pretty challenging in the 19th century, and in fact South Carolina did left it until 1949 to legalize divorce at all. South Carolina. Yeehaw! The idea of a woman, that's where Peter's from. Peter's from South Carolina. Aren't you, Peter? The idea of a woman choosing to divorce a man was practically unheard of, apart from under extreme conditions, and they had to be really extreme. Many states felt that a man should be allowed to physically abuse his wife a number of times before she became eligible for divorce. Am I right, Peter? Peter's on the 8th time. He gets to 9, or maybe 10. It's a case for divorce. It's a case for divorce. Better watch out, Peter. Watch out! For example, in a case from 1861, a woman filed for divorce after her husband clubbed her unconscious with a block of wood, following an argument about whether the dog should be allowed to sleep on the bed. Really? The judge ruled that this was not sufficient grounds for divorce. It only happened once, and the couple had to stay married. It was much easier for a man to get out of a relationship, simply send his disobedient wife to a mental asylum and get on with the rest of his life in peace. Between around 1850 and 1900, it was shockingly common for women to be institutionalized for being opinionated or for not being submissive and controllable. From 1860, Elizabeth Packer from Jacksonville, Illinois, spent 3 years in the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane after disagreeing with the radical religious beliefs of her nutty pastor husband. Things reached a boiling point when she had the audacity to stand up in the middle of one of his sermons and announce that she was going to the Methodist church just over the road. Well, she does sound mental, doesn't she? Lock her up! After 3 years of wrongful incarceration, wrongful, please, Danny, she deserved it. Am I right, Peter? She eventually won a battle in court to prove her sanity and went on to form the Anti-Insane Asylum Society. But it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that husbands had a better way to get rid of their wives, as locking up disobedient women became frowned upon in society. Good. Elizabeth was one of the more fortunate examples, though some of these women were destined to spend the rest of their lives in a mental institution for the most ridiculous of reasons. Between 1865 and 1898, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia recorded a long list of female admissions on such grounds as laziness, jealousy, asthma, disappointed love, imaginary female trouble. Imaginary female trouble. Then why are you in prison? Imaginary female trouble. Doesn't sound like a real thing, does it? Because it's not a real thing, is it? Egotism, bad habits. Reading a novel, gathering in the head, and masturbation. Life just seemed so relentlessly grim for so many people in the bad old days that the happiest person in the treasured family photograph on the wall is probably the one with the droopy arms and the bulging vacant eyes. From the plague! This has been an episode of Business Blaze brought to you by Rotting Turtle, my new perfume. You can get this at rottingturtle.net. Be a good legend. It smells fantastic. I'm already got enough on me. And the smell lasts, makes you smell fresh and fragrant all day. Nothing like a rotting turtle, in fact. Sort of citrusy and delicious. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. rottingturtle.net.
Cocaína. No. Flour.